Now let's look at another approach to the study of sexuality, and that would be psychiatry. Psychiatry, as I'm sure you know, is concerned with mental health and sickness, and it's the branch of medicine that is concerned with mental and behavioral disorders. It has had a lot to say about sex, but its contributions have been more controversial than those of the other branches of medicine for several reasons. We still have only a very limited understanding of how the brain generates mental states. Thus, theories have tended to be highly speculative, and wildly disparate theories have been put forward by different doctors, even at the same time and place. Doctors have tended to view sexual problems as a health and disease issue. For example, Richard von Krafft-Ebing, born in 1840 and died in 1902, wrote a best-selling treatise entitled Psychopathia Sexualis in 1886 that dealt with sexual disorders. Krafft-Ebing claimed the right to name sexual disorders and to diagnose people who suffered from them. Was he responding to a plea for understanding and treatment from deeply disturbed individuals, or was he seeking to impose his own code of sexual propriety on people who would otherwise have had perfectly harmless and satisfying sex lives, as some modern critics have argued? Did he really have the right to determine whether people should practice such activities or not, and whether activity should be prevented by legal or medical means? Despite these controversies, the idea that sexual aberrations can be named or diagnosed is codified in the American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, known as the DSM. It is revised periodically. For example, in 1973, after much struggle, homosexuality was removed from the list of mental disorders. It should be noted that a new one is coming out very soon as I speak this into the computer in 2013, and there should be one out in the fall. Many other questionable sexual disorders are also listed in the DSM, however. These include gender identity disorder of childhood, which is boys who feel and act like girls, and vice versa, and several disorders come straight out of the Psychopathia Sexualis. But there is now a difference. The DSM now emphasizes that with some exceptions, a sexual condition is not a disorder unless it causes distress to the person who experiences it. In a sense, the affected person must participate in the diagnostic process. Another way in which sexuality is studied is through the discipline of psychology. Psychologists have taken diverse approaches to sexuality. Psychology, again, as I'm sure you know, is the study of mental processes and behaviors, and it has splintered into many kinds of overlapping subdisciplines, several of which offer unique perspectives on sexuality. Probably the most significant branch in the study of sexuality is social psychology, the study of how we think about, influence, and relate to other people. Social psychologists concern themselves with all kinds of sexual matters, like sexual attraction in relationships, gender differences, homosexuality, sexual assault, intimate partner violence, and anti-gay prejudice. Social psychology studies may be descriptive or experimental. A descriptive study might entail observing and comparing the flirtatious behavior of men and women in public spaces. An experimental study might be a researcher studying the effect of some intervention on research subjects. Studies commonly have a group of comparison subjects who are not exposed to the intervention, which would be the controls, and they are compared to the ones who are being treated. One example of an experimental study was done at UCLA, and it was asking the question of whether portrayals of sexual violence in media and pornography make men more accepting of such violence, as has been asserted by many feminists. From a group of male college students, half were assigned randomly to watch movies that portrayed sexual violence against women. The experimental group saw movies in which a woman was raped but subsequently fell in love with her rapist. The controls, the other students, watched movies that contained no sexual violence. A few days later, the students were given a sexual attitude questionnaire. The results supported the feminist contention. Male students who watched sexually violent movies expressed significantly more accepting attitudes toward sexual violence than the men in the control group. This and other experimental studies have convinced the researchers that exposure to images of sexual violence really does predispose some men to commit sexual assaults against women. Psychobiologists, also known as biological psychologists, occupy the interface between psychology and the biological sciences, especially neuroscience and endocrinology. Psychobiologists are interested in sexual behaviors and often study these behaviors in lab animals rather than in humans, because their experiments may involve risk to their subjects, or they may require killing the animals in order to analyze their brains or other organs. Recent advances in brain imaging technology have allowed them to study the brain basis of sexuality in living humans. Gert Holstege, and his colleagues have used positron emission tomography, known as PET scanning, to visualize the patterns of brain activity that occurred during orgasm. A third area of psychology is cultural or cross-cultural psychology. This type of psychologist concerns themselves with the influence of ethnic and cultural diversity on thought, behavior, and interpersonal relationships. Where cultural psychology focuses on differences between entire societies, it overlaps extensively with anthropology, especially the branch known as cultural anthropology. The prime research method employed by cultural psychologists is fieldwork. Researchers may spend months or even years embedded in the societies that they study. Sometimes they participate fully in those societies' cultural practices. Margaret Mead, shown here, was a pioneer in this field. She was born in 1901 and died in 1978. She studied the development of sexual attitudes and gender differences in Pacific Island societies. They have found that sex practices and attitudes are far more diverse than might be imagined. Gilbert Hurt, for example, a cultural anthropologist who now directs the Human Sexuality Program at San Francisco State University, did the following research. Starting in 1974, he spent extended periods of time among the Sambia, a small society indigenous to the highland rainforests of New Guinea. It was known prior to his work that the Sambia engaged in ritualized homosexual practices, but he provided more detail and investigated symbolic environments in which these practices occurred. He found that the Sambia believe that boys can become men only by ingesting semen, which is thought to trigger puberty and to instill the qualities of manhood. Before puberty, boys are removed from their families, and for about 10 years they are housed collectively. During this period, they must engage in a secret daily ritual that involves male-on-male fellatio, oral sex, and the younger boys take the receptive role, swallowing the ejaculate of the older boys. Later, as they mature physically, they take the insertive role. And at the end of the 10-year period, the boys, now young men, leave the group and take wives. Contrary to what one might think, this compulsory and exclusive homosexual behavior has no apparent effect on the men's ultimate sexual orientation. It is now known that similar beliefs and practices exist or existed widely throughout Melanesia, but sometimes the transfer of semen is accomplished by means of anal rather than oral sex. Cultural psychologists have also found some striking variations in the criteria used to judge sexual attractiveness, as well as the kinds of sexual relationships that are sanctioned in different societies. For example, monogamous versus polygamous marriages. Many diverse ethnic and cultural traditions exist in the United States, so there's ample room for cultural studies of sexuality and gender within our own society. For instance, some Native Americans preserve an ancient tradition that assigns a special spiritual role to transgendered individuals. Some Hispanics, on the other hand, may be influenced by the Latin American culture of machismo, which emphasizes stereotypical masculinity. Sexual behavior differs greatly among different groups. Only 27% of Asian American high school students ever engaged in penile vaginal intercourse, compared with 72% of African American students. Understanding the roots of such cultural differences could aid efforts to reduce unwanted pregnancy and STIs among teenagers. Cultural diversity is not a sexual free-for-all. Some aspects of human sexuality are remarkably consistent from one society to another. Here are some examples. The proportion of the population that is homosexual seems to be roughly similar from one society to another. Another example is facial beauty is judged fairly consistently across disparate cultures. And finally, public exposure of genitals, especially adult women's genitals, is prohibited in almost all cultures.